Hi all, and welcome to my short training session on robust vocabulary instruction. Um, now, the words knowledge-rich curriculum are ones that are pretty commonplace in any kind of curriculum discussions at the moment. And I think lots of us adhere, of course, to kind of like long-term knowledge-rich curriculum design. But I recently started to think what actually takes place within my lesson that is kind of explicitly knowledge building. And by that, I mean that what is going on at an individual lesson level that shows I subscribe to the philosophy of a knowledge-rich curriculum. Now, that's a slightly strange question, actually, because lots of the principles behind knowledge-rich curriculum design are at a long-term level. But in short, in individual lessons, you will see high-level subject knowledge kind of being directly instructed to pupils via expositions that are kind of scripted and often well thought through. You'll see lots of questioning and rigorous comprehension questioning to follow up on this and make sure that this knowledge is embedded. All the while, this is going to be sequenced like at an individual lesson level, of course, with knowledge being built sequentially, but also at a longer term level so that knowledge can be built upon and really build these broad schemas of learning. But I couldn't help think that I was possibly missing a trick. Because even if we do all of the above, I think the level of thinking that our students are able to achieve is still possibly limited. And that's because without explicitly and deliberately teaching new ways, the way that our students think remains one-dimensional. And this is because words aren't just new ways of expressing yourself, though like that's a wonderful byproduct, right? And seeing great expression in student writing is wonderful. But in actual fact, I think new words allow for more precision of thought. And I love this quote by Timothy Shanahan, who says, word meanings actually function as an index of a much richer and harder to measure constellation of understandings and experiences. Like in more simple terms, vocabulary opens up new ways for our students to think. And that doesn't happen unless we explicitly teach them new words. So think, for instance, about we've got a child talking about the Crusades, okay? And that child might know that Pope Urban II issued a papal bull that asked Christians to go on crusade. Great knowledge, right? But if we add vocabulary to the formula, then that child might now know that Christian knights felt emboldened and empowered to answer the Pope's call. Their knowledge is deeper, their knowledge is more complex. The words emboldened and empower aren't just new forms of expression, but they tell us a lot about exactly how those Christian knights felt in response to the Pope's call. So actually explicitly teaching new words can have a significant impact on both the quality of student expression, but it can also open up new avenues of thinking for our students. And that's really exciting. Now, I've been experimenting with a model of vocabulary instruction with my classes this year, and I wanted to share this model and explain really why I think it should be a pivotal feature of any knowledge building in our history curriculum. Before I move on to the model and talk you through the model, I did just want to share two examples that suggest that this type of vocabulary instruction is working. The first is from a student who's got a target level of a 5. I'm not going to read through the whole example, and if you are interested in this, you can read through the example on my blog. But the explicitly taught words here are ostracized and diminished. Now that word ostracize captures so much about the way that the Northern Earls felt in the Elizabethan royal court. It is much more than the word left out, because ostracized carries with it connotations of alienation, having the power and losing the power at some point, and a sense of like deliberate kind of policy in which someone is left out of a particular political circle. So ostracize isn't just a brilliant word to kind of write, but actually ostracize allows for a certain type of thought. It opens up a new way of thinking. The second example is a student with a level 4 target. And again, like the two key words here that they've been taught are transcend and antidote. And just picking up on that word antidote and that final sentence, therefore theatre shows there was a golden age because it could be an antidote to the suffering of the working classes. Again, that idea of theatre being something that not only transcends class boundary and social hierarchy in the Elizabethan age, but actually functions as an antidote to the suffering of the working classes is a really deep and rich level of understanding. So, if I were to pause there and just quickly run through what we've heard so far. Firstly, vocabulary instruction is a key part of putting a knowledge-rich curriculum into action. I truly believe that. Secondly, teaching vocabulary opens up these new ways of thinking for our students. And third, these words add more complexity and add more depth to explanations and descriptions given by our pupils. With that in mind, let's think about the model that I've been using and a possible kind of avenue for embedding vocabulary instruction into your classroom. Let's start with some don'ts. The don'ts are important because I have always been aware, I think, that teaching vocabulary is really important. And I think I thought I was doing it, but in actual fact, I was just skirting around what I really needed to be doing, which was deliberately and robustly teaching new vocabulary. So here are the things that we don't work and that we shouldn't really rely on. The first and the big one is just assuming that new encounters with new words through reading is going to be enough. Actually, there's lots of evidence to suggest that this just isn't the case and that you need to be deliberate with your instruction of new words. The second big don't is to repetitively teach new vocabulary with the same definition. We want these words to be transferable, and actually lots of the onus on that comes on us, and we need to be clear about what words we've taught, and we need to be clear about varying the use of these words in our own language. And finally, don't just assume that by asking students to write a sentence using the new word that job done, we finished. Because actually we need students to take advantage of that deep and interconnected nature of vocabulary. So those are my three big don'ts. Let's start thinking about the do's. And I think the starting point for the do's is a 2013 report by Beck, McCown and Kukan, which really put out a blueprint, I think, for robust vocabulary instruction. And their starting point was to identify the best words to teach. And the image I've got on the screen right now might be pretty familiar, really, to any teacher. They're the word tiers. Tier 1 words, Tier 2 and Tier 3. Now, Tier 1 words are typically found in oral language. And I think I'm not going to go hard on kind of explaining what these word tiers are, but I will briefly go through them. Tier 1, typically found in oral language. They're on high frequency word lists. They are things like girl, sad, book. They're the kind of words that our students will encounter time and time and time again and do not require us to teach them. Tier 2 words are more characteristic of written expression. They're not so common in conversation, and while they might be used across different disciplines, in actual fact, they're largely words that our students aren't going to randomly encounter. And finally, Tier 3 words are those super subject-specific words. They're words like housecarl, anschluss, galleon, and autobahn. They're the words that often appear in the keyword box in a textbook, and that previously I've encouraged my students to write down. But I would make the argument that having students focus on Tier 3 words really misses the point of robust vocabulary instruction. And if we want to expand the minds of our students and have them think in these new ways, then we should focus on the instruction of Tier 2 vocabulary. And kind of with that in mind, Beck, McCown and Kukan came up with exactly the same conclusion. In fact, I robbed their conclusion in that sense. I am just exactly parroting what they say. They say explicitly teach Tier 2 vocabulary. And like, as I said, that possibly feels counterintuitive because if we're teaching a lesson on Elizabethan England, surely we have to teach them what the word galleon means. But actually, I think words like galleon will crop up so often in a lesson on the Spanish Armada, for instance, that through comprehension questioning, that word is embedded quite quickly into our students' kind of vocabulary index. In actual fact, it's the Tier 2 words that require robust vocabulary instruction, and these are the words that allow us to be more precise with our thought. And they allow us to be more precise because they do two different things. The first thing they do is they add more depth to student explanations. The second thing they do is add more complexity. Again, let's take an example. A year 7's writing an essay on why William won the Battle of Hastings. Knowing that the Battle of Stamford Bridge had a debilitating effect on the army of Harold Godwinson is a deeper understanding than Harold Godwinson was left weak after Stamford Bridge. Debilitating has so much weight to it, it carries such depth that students really, really start to get to grips with the reasons that Harold lost that battle. And in fact, knowing that word debilitating conjures all sorts of associated words and concepts that give us so much more than just weak. So tier 2 words add depth. And as I said, they also add this complexity and nuance. So again, the creation of Pentonville Prison constituted a seismic change in systems of punishment, is a more complex explanation than the creation of Pentonville changed punishment. And there's lots of literature out there kind of in the world of history academia around the teaching of conceptual vocabulary and causal vocabulary and vocabulary that's linked to change, etc. I think that stuff is absolutely brilliant. I would just say that within those instructions, we should be adding other tier 2 words, and we will come to kind of the selection process shortly. So tier 2 words are incredibly important for us in achieving what we're looking for with robust vocabulary instructions. But we also need to think practically. And if we want to harness the power of vocabulary, then we should really be clear about what tier 2 words we're teaching and how many, etc., etc. And the first step really should be verification. So when considering a new word to teach that you think will be helpful for improving the quality of student thinking, put it through the following set of questions. First of all, is it tier 2? The word I'll take here as an example is that one that we looked at earlier, ostracized, and so yes, it's tier 2. Secondly, can that word be used in multiple contexts? Well, yeah, ostracized is a brilliant, powerful word for all of the reasons that I went through earlier. And anytime I teach about revolution and social change, it's going to be a useful word for me. So yes, I can use it in multiple contexts. Does the word open up new ways of thinking about a topic or concept? Yes, ostracized absolutely does. It's powerful in that sense. And can the word be tethered to prior learning? The answer to that, again, is yes. My students have encountered people being ostracized in the past in our history lessons. They just haven't really known how to articulate it. So putting those tier 2 words through those 3 sets of questions is an important step to take. Beyond this, and I think perhaps before this, as we're kind of getting to the point where we might put our words through those tests, we need to kind of think about, what words are, as I said, what words are we going to put through that test? And there's no point kind of plucking a tier 2 word out of thin air and hoping that it's going to have a natural fit within a sequence of learning and then it's going to achieve exactly what you want it to achieve, which is to open up those new ways of thinking. And so asking those questions help clarify our choices, but we need to take this further by leaning on our subject expertise. Now, the approach I've taken is to think critically and in some ways mine the criticality of others and considered what vivid and rich historical explanation might look like in relation to a final outcome. So when teaching a lesson sequence on the revolt of the Northern Earls, it makes sense to consider the larger conceptual question, why did the Northern Earls revolt? Okay, as a subject specialist, if I know that's the direction that this learning is going, then I might come to the conclusion that the Earls felt ostracized. They viewed the religious settlement as an affront to their long-standing Catholic beliefs. And in many ways, they felt legitimized and empowered by foreign support. Okay, well, there are 4 brilliant words there: ostracize, affront, legitimize, and empower, that I have kind of drawn from my own subject expertise that are going to allow my students to access this material in a more critical manner. So the second kind of thing to that moment to pause and really think about this is that tier 2 vocabulary is the vocab that should be prioritized for instruction. Thinking back from a final outcome can help with the selection of those words. And we can test for the rigor of the vocabulary by putting the vocabulary through those questions, by thinking about versatility, complexity, and the ability to tether to old learning. So we know that vocabulary is important, and we know what vocabulary is important. Now we just need to be clear about how we teach it so that that vocabulary sticks. And the remainder of this presentation really just looks at that idea. And I think there are all sorts of avenues we can go down here. And again, Beck, McCown and Kuchen, they put out something of a blueprint for this. And they basically say, teach vocabulary in a way where you concentrate on robustness and frequency. Now, frequency speaks for itself. Yeah, we want our students to encounter these words a lot. And when we introduce a new word, we absolutely should not just kind of assume that them writing the definition in their books is enough and that, yeah, we're not going to return to it. In fact, we need to return to that word within that lesson, within the passage of learning, across a series of lessons, and then further down the line in different contexts. So frequency is really important. Robustness is also critical, and I guess is less self-evident and can come in many forms, right? So ensuring that our vocabulary is robust essentially means we need to kind of diversify its use through questioning, through the use of examples and non-examples, and once again, demand its use across transferable contexts. Learning a word in a single context is not enough. So here's the model that I use. The slide that I introduce new vocab on looks exactly like this. It will always look like this, so students know exactly what they're meant to be doing. I introduce no more than 2 words per lesson. I want to reduce cognitive overload. I also really want to embed these words into the students' vocabulary index. So 2 words. I then look for a student-friendly definition, and there are all sorts of places online that you can find these things. So I script the definition. I tether the word to a familiar context, in this case, to content from other GCSE units that my students study, and I accompany the word with a simple icon. Now, this is a method I found that works for me. Other people may disagree, but I think it makes sense to have the word with its simple definition within a context that's familiar, and the icon to try and trigger memory. Now, questioning at this stage is really, really important. And I would, once students have copied down the word and the definition, now start to demand the use of that word and start questioning around that word. So describe a time when you have, in this case it might be transcended something, or which word goes with, and I might ask them to apply the word antidote to a particular setting or feeling or emotion or something that they've experienced. And those seemingly fundamental, these questions are critical, because what they're doing is they're asking our students to associate the word with other pieces of information or vocabulary, or manipulate the word to fit a particular setting. And getting those things right is actually difficult for our students, and they're both key facets of long-term vocabulary building. So that's the first step, and I think that's how I introduce the words within a lesson, and those words will be returned to across that lesson, again with lots of questioning. Then the follow-up looks something like this, and I have to confess, like, the above template is not like a hard and fast rule, and actually I find that like, generally speaking, lots of rigorous questioning is enough to embed the word, and actually going down the route of like very formalized, activity-based kind of like attempts to embed the word are possibly not required. I think what the template that I've got there is useful for is kind of showing you the use of examples and non-examples. I think that's a really, really effective way to embed vocabulary. So when teaching the word radical, I gave a load of set of examples and non-examples. So the teacher had a radical idea, they would sit in silence and the students would do all the teaching. Yeah, it's radical. The teacher had a radical idea. Instead of 2 homework per week, the class would only get 1. No, that's not radical. And obviously, kind of using those examples and non-examples and sharing those with my children it is quite an effective strategy in terms of embedding this stuff. Obviously, planning those examples and non-examples is something that needs to come beforehand. So we introduce the word, we follow up with like regular encounters with that word, often with the use of examples and non-examples, and we follow up with questioning. Finally then, like, what about the students using the word? The first thing I would say is I treat kind of vocabulary in the same way that I might treat certain piece of substantive knowledge. It's incorporated into my daily review process. So students will always be defining words within that daily review. Then when we are talking through the daily review, then I might demand their application and demand transferability in the use. The second thing is that we obviously want these our students to use these words. And I do a lot of work in my class on sentence level instruction. And so I might have a very simple kind of single sentence, not simple, a complex sentence. And I will have words that I am asking students to use, the words that they've learnt, and I will be demanding their use. And I think there's a really, really important part of this, which is that we need to demand the use of this vocabulary. We need to use the vocabulary in our own language so that students are regularly encountering it. And we need to kind of give feedback when students are not using it correctly or are not using it at all. And that really is quite a critical step. So that really is everything for me. Thank you to Mr. Patterson for having me on. And if you are like kind of interested or you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch via Twitter. I've also blogged about this, so you can read about this in a bit more detail there. But that is a short guide to robust vocabulary instruction in the history classroom. I hope you enjoyed.